Unit 12, Issues of the 1920s. Learning Objectives. Examine the challenges relating to civil liberties regarding immigrants. Describe the Scopes Trial of 1925. Understand the impact of Prohibition. Describe the changes in social and economic status for women. Big concepts. During the 1920s, Americans feared socialists and anarchists from Eastern Europe and Russia. This led to a Red Scare. Many immigrants were deported back to Russia. Congress began passing immigration quota acts to restrict immigration. The 1920s was a period of new modern ideas centered in urban areas. Modernism included and accepted human evolution. In Tennessee, the teaching of evolution was outlawed by the Butler Act. John Scopes, a teacher, taught evolution in a science class in Dayton, Tennessee to challenge the Butler Act. Scopes was arrested. His trial brought national attention to the conflict between traditional conservative culture and the new modernism spreading across the country. Progressivism in World War I led to Prohibition, the 18th Amendment. Alcohol became illegal to make and sell. Criminals built large organized crime empires selling illegal alcohol. World War I also led to women leaving their traditional roles in the home and working and living in America's growing cities. Some women began smoking, dressing provocatively, and going to nightclubs. Women took clerical and office jobs and began attending women's colleges. The Red Scare. The first Red Scare. Russia became the first communist state in history due to the issues stemming from World War I and the Bolshevik Revolution. Many Americans feared that communism would spread to the United States. Backlash began to brew against immigrants from Russia. It didn't help that anarchists began delivering mail bombs and bombing Wall Street. Attorney General Mitchell Palmer began deporting immigrants. These deportations violated many constitutional rights and were known as the Palmer Raids. Here's the Wall Street bombing. On the right is a political cartoon. Fear of chaos in the United States by the working class. Strikes, disorder, Bolshevism, chaos could lead to what? The beginning of the Soviet project. So World War I led to the end of the Russian Tsar and the rise of Bolshevism, which led to the first communist state, the USSR, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. What is communism? It's an economic system that believes in collective ownership in a planned, centralized economy. The theory is that everybody pools their resources and labor to evenly distribute everything. Karl Marx is the father of communism. And this is Vladimir Lenin in the picture, the leader and the first leader of the USSR and leader of the Bolshevik Revolution. So the Bolshevik Revolution leads to a lot of fear in the United States. The U.S. was already dealing with anarchists stemming way back to the end of the 19th century. We talked about the Haymarket Square bombings, the fear of anarchists infiltrating labor unions, and they start mailing out bombs and bombing places like Wall Street leads to this desire to deport Russian immigrants. And it leads to Congress passing the Immigration Quota Act, which limited the number of immigrants allowed entry into the United States. So this political cartoon kind of sums up the general fears of allowing European anarchists into the United States. It leads to limits on how many immigrants could come from certain countries. And it completely excluded immigrants from Asia, which is kind of building on what we talked about with the Chinese Exclusion Act earlier. which was passed back in the 1880s. All right, our next topic is a religious topic, and it's involving Tennessee. It's the Scopes trial. And Tennessee passed something called the Butler Act, which prohibited the teaching of evolution in public schools in the state. So Scopes was encouraged by the American Civil Liberties Union to teach evolution, to challenge the Butler Act. So we have a conflict brewing between science and religion in the United States in the 1920s. So a lot of conservative Americans felt that modernism, these are the issues that they felt were related to modernism in the United States, the acceptance of science would lead to atheism and a religiousless state, a religiousness America. So Scopes gets, there's going to be a big trial, it's called the Monkey Trial, and ACLU brings in Clarence Darrow. He's one of the most famous attorneys in the United States. He's known for taking on and helping the underdog in big criminal defense cases. And he's regarded as one of the greatest defense lawyers in American history. And he's going to defend John Scopes in the tiny town of Dayton, Tennessee. And the media descends upon this town in it's in East Tennessee, southeastern Tennessee. The prosecution, William Jennings Bryan, who we talked quite a bit about in class, he was the former presidential candidate who ran against McKinley. He gave the Cross of Gold speech. He ends up being Woodrow Wilson's Secretary of State for several years. He's going to be one of the prosecutors. He was an anti-evolutionist. He was incredibly religious, and he shows up to defend the Bible. So how does the Scopes trial conclude? The trial lasts 8 days. The defense didn't really think they were going to win. They were trying to draw attention to this law that had been passed in Tennessee, the Butler Act. But there's a big highlight of the case is Bryan is called as a witness to defend the Bible, and there's a 2-hour tense confrontation between Clarence Darrow and William Jennings Bryan over the merits of the Bible and evolution. At the conclusion of the trial, it only took the jury 9 minutes of deliberation, and Scopes is found guilty and ordered to pay a $100 fine. Our next topic is Prohibition, and Prohibition is one of the final acts of the progressive movement. It's the 18th Amendment bans the manufacture and sale of alcohol. Many progressives felt that alcohol was corrupting society, it was destroying families, so they pushed for this amendment, and it lasts from 1919 to 1933. But prohibitionists didn't really look at what the negative effects of prohibition could be, and it's going to lead to organized crime. Americans still want alcohol, and they can't get it legally, so criminal networks are going to start to distribute illegal alcohol, and they're going to fight with local police and against one another for control of large markets like Chicago, New York City, large urban areas. The federal government's going to use the FBI to go after organized crime. It's going to be incredibly expensive to enforce prohibition. And we have Al Capone. It's going to become one of the most famous of the mobsters, who's going to lead a huge organized crime network, distributing alcohol and doing other illegal activities. So when you distribute alcohol illegally, it's called bootlegging. And a lot of Americans bootlegged. It was very popular, very common in East Tennessee and Appalachia for there to be bootleggers. People made alcohol in their basements and their bathtubs. They brought it in from Canada, and they distributed it illegally throughout the United States. Americans still want to drink, so they're going to gather in speakeasies, secret clubs and bars that you had to speak quietly to get into. And this is where bootlegged alcohol was sold. And Prohibition becomes more and more unpopular at the onset of the Great Depression. Governments and Americans and businesses are looking for Prohibition to be repealed, and so the 21st Amendment is ratified to repeal the 18th Amendment. And this ends Prohibition in 1933. The next topic we're talking about 1920s issues is women's issues. World War I, a lot of women left their traditional roles as wives and mothers in the house and went and worked. And a lot of women feel liberated leaving the home and working in these war factories during World War I. And when the war ends, there's a continuing trend for women to be working and to live in cities and to socialize. So we have flappers, and this is a nickname given to women who reject the traditional role of women, and they wore dresses, smoked, drank, and danced. So we have another conflict between modernism and traditionalism, and this is women leading the forefront here, fighting against traditional roles of women. And we have birth control. So we have the emergence of birth control for women. Margaret Sanger was a birth control activist and nurse, and Sanger popularized the term birth control. She opens the first birth control clinic in the United States, and birth control was seen as another way for women to be liberated and to leave their traditional roles at the home. And then we had the rise and popularity of women's colleges. During World War I, women took the jobs of men, and they wanted to keep these jobs. And a lot of them are feeling like they're getting pushed back into the home, and they feel like they're losing their voice in society. And this all is going to change drastically through education. Women begin attending women's colleges in large numbers starting in the 1920s. Let's look at our timeline. So 1918 is the end of World War I. November 11th, 1918 marks the end of this terrible global conflict that, killed millions of humans and wounded millions more. The next year we have Prohibition. So that's when the 18th Amendment's passed, 1919. We also have the beginning of the Palmer Raids, the movement to expel radicals and potential communists and Russians. And this is going to kind of culminate in Congress passing some more anti-immigration laws, these Quota Acts. That's in 1924. 1925 is the Scopes trial. That's also, remember we talked about the peak of the Harlem Renaissance. So the mid-1920s, we have all sorts of things occurring in the United States. And here we have science versus religion, this big battle, modernism versus traditionalism, seen in this Scopes trial, the monkey trial in Dayton, Tennessee. 1929, Al Capone's going to finally get arrested for tax evasion. So he was the leader of one of the largest bootlegging criminal networks in the United States. And then it all comes crashing down towards the end of 1929 with the beginning of the Great Depression.